Previously on Civic SciCommTV Africa with Stephanie Okeyo.
Where do you see the roots of podcast in 5 years to come?
Love this question. It's my favorite. I always say that I want to be the Oprah of science, and I'm going to say that and keep saying it until it happens, and people will take these links and say she said it. So yeah, definitely I want to create this premium platform of Africans in STEM globally. Want it to be on demand and live, because I think these types of conversations should be readily and accessibly available. So that's sort of where we see it in terms of the visual content.
Hello, today's episode we're joined by Wealth Okete, biochemist and the host of ImmunoAfrica, also a podcast known as Immunology in Africa. But I'm going to let Wealth describe to us what you do and your interests.
Thank you very much, Stephanie, for this invitation. My name is Wealth Okete. I am from Nigeria. I am a trained biochemist, and so shortly after I left university, I got into science communication. I like to say I stumbled into science communication because while in the university, I had never come across that term. So when I read an article by one of my mentors, Akazwe, who wrote an article about science communication and its impact in Africa, I thought it was a worthy field to delve into. So I started out writing newspaper articles for a local newspaper agency in my city. And so I wrote for them for a few years. A couple of months, more than a year, not up to 2 years. And then, I just evolved in the journey. And then in 2022, about 3 years after I got into science communication, I decided to start a podcast, the Immunology in Africa podcast. And I think one thing that is really interesting about the podcast is how it allows me to blend my interest in science communication and my passion for research. Because as an undergraduate, I took keen interest in immunology and vaccines and infectious diseases in my third year when we took a course that explored the immune system. So when the idea for launching a podcast came, it made sense that I would gravitate towards, starting a podcast that I was a bit comfortable with, because it was in a field that I had keen interest in. And also because at that point, I didn't know what was happening so much in the field of immunology from an African context. So I thought launching the podcast would educate me about happenings in immunology and also allow me to also, spread the gospel of African immunology, let other individuals know what's happening, what African scientists are doing in that field. So I think that's a bit about myself.
Thank you, Wealth. And that's quite interesting. Just to poke on what you said, that you're an undergraduate, you came to know about science communication after finishing your undergraduate studies, which is also a similar case to mine. With your journey per se right now, how important do you think it is to start introducing or engaging people within science communication and undergraduates in this case within that specific field?
Well, I think it's something that is very, very dear to my heart, although I've not been able to do anything about it, but it's a conversation I've had with a science communicator friend of mine, and that conversation I've also had with myself in my mind about, exposing undergraduates to science communication. I think it's very, very important. Like the potentials and the benefits it can have will be immense, because there is no science, even when we're talking about scientific research, there's no science without the science being communicated. I think there's a quote that says, science is not complete without it being communicated. So beyond the benefit of maybe science communication, trying to, a good communicator can help you, progress in your career, can have some very, very important benefits for undergraduate students to know, learning how to write, how to speak. Even in during undergraduate, people do presentations. So the benefits or the impact can really be immense, and has can be extensive even beyond the whole scientific space, and having to do with research, and also allow them to also engage with communities. So I think it's important that we expose undergraduate students to science communication early enough, because sometimes I feel like in Africa, there are lots of things happening that we are not talking about yet, because maybe individuals who will be interested in that aspect of work, they don't know yet about science communication, or they don't feel they can communicate science. So if undergraduates are exposed on time, they could develop interest in different aspects of science communication that align with their interest, maybe in research or in other aspect of their work, and then we can, have this more robust and comprehensive science communication coming out of the continent.
And from actually also sharing your journey, you mentioned you started with writing. So your science communication started with writings. How did you progress to a podcast, and why even a podcast?
Well, I still write. I started with writing, but I still write. Okay, so I'm just going to share this full story. So when the idea for launching into science communication came, I wasn't sure what to start with. I had been writing for like maybe since secondary school days. I just had this flair for writing. So I wasn't sure what to start with. So when I discussed with my elder sister, who kind of plays a role of the mentor sometimes, she suggested I should go on maybe TV and radio and talk about science, because there was like a TV station not very far from our house here in Benin. So, but I told her, no, I don't want to go on TV. I'm actually very I'm quite introverted and I'm quite shy. I said, no, I wouldn't want to talk about science on TV. So I went for an event, and I also met with a TV presenter, and I tell her I want to go into science communication. And she's like, yeah, I can allow you to come on my show and talk. And I tell her, no, please, I don't want to talk on TV or radio. And then I tell her, okay, can't you connect me with a place I can write, maybe a magazine or a newspaper? And then she mentions the newspaper agency that I ended up starting out with that. So I went to the editor and then spoke with him, and then I started writing for them. So starting out, the first set of opportunities that presented themselves to me, as if, life or God knew, okay, I was going to delve into podcasting later, where speaking opportunities or opportunities that require you to appear on TV or speak. But because I didn't feel comfortable fitting into those shoes, I didn't feel confident fitting into those shoes. I felt, okay, yeah, you can write. People would know who is writing. But if you're on TV, if you go and say something wrong, you probably will get into much trouble for doing that, right? So I just wanted something, I just wanted to start out from somewhere that I would say was comfortable and convenient for me. And writing was like my go-to place of comfort. And regards my evolution, so when I started science communication, there was this energy to launch something. I wanted to start a blog then, but it didn't work out. So, and then about 1 year later, I wanted to start something else, maybe write about immunology and nutrition, because I had an interest in nutrition at some point. That still didn't work out. So I even posted it on social media. Then I was going to launch something new, but that didn't work out. So in I think that was 2021. I started making posts on Instagram about science and all of that. It was just something I just started doing around November. So that was when I even started realize that, okay, podcasting was becoming a thing. People were doing podcasts. There was also a scientist and science communicator who is also a podcaster. I connected with on Instagram. So I listened to his podcast and I felt, oh wow, this thing is cool. Maybe this could be a final opportunity for me to start a project. So when I reached out to him that I was interested in podcasting, so he kind of just discussed with me, and even maybe I had small fire, but the way he talked with me just kind of added fuel to my fire, and I became so motivated to start a podcast. And when I asked myself, what can I do a podcast about? I knew it had to be immunology, because delving into another topic, first, podcasting was kind of stepping out of my comfort zone for me, because I've been convenient or comfortable with writing, but I had to just have a balance. So I cannot do podcasting in a field that I'm not really familiar with. So because I already had this interest and passion in immunology, it made sense that, okay, if podcasting would not be so convenient, I should have my second feet in a field that's very, very convenient. So that is why I decided to start a podcast about African immunology research. And so I think that's basically how it happened.
It's quite an interesting journey of trial and error and testing. And because you've spoken of writing, trying then blogging, and also social media now with the posts, and then found somebody who's doing a podcast. Within that aspect of scouting what to do and also trying to figure out how to start a podcast, how was the landscape for you? Were there many other science podcasts within the continent that you could look up to? Or how did you find it in terms of existing examples?
Okay, so when I started out, I didn't really know much about podcasting. When I decided to launch a podcast, I just knew, okay, I'd listened to a few episodes from maybe one or two podcasts, especially from the podcaster who gave me assistance, but I didn't know much about the podcasting landscape in Africa. So I think because I tried previous projects that, tried launching previous projects that didn't, ended up, launching. I made attempts at launching previous projects. I told myself that this project, I was going to, make significant progress before, finding out how things really are. Mm-hmm. So I'd already made some progress with planning, even started looking out for guests before I said, okay, let me even check online for podcasts in Africa. So that was when I got to know about the Root of the Science podcast by Ann Chisa. Interestingly, we had already connected on Twitter. So I looked up our episode and listened to it, and I felt, this makes sense. This is something that I can have similar conversations with scientists or immunologists when I listen to a podcast. So we did not connect then, but I think I did send her a DM on Twitter. That was Twitter then, and then I just thought I wanted to launch a podcast, and then our work was inspiring, and then she kind of just encouraged me and all of that. We needed more podcasters in the continent, but we didn't connect much. But I think there was another opportunity for us to connect more later on. But the guidance I received mostly was from the podcast I connected with on Instagram, who is not African. Is European, but that was the major guidance I received. I didn't know much about podcasting in Africa. It was after I got into the podcasting state and the podcasting sphere that I started, learning more about podcasts in Africa, how that they were science and they were also podcasts that were addressing different issues in the context of the continent.
So for you hit the road running. You hit the road and you just started running and learn along the way.
Yeah.
And congratulations! Actually, this month you hit your second year with viewership of over 50 countries. What would you consider your greatest insight in this work?
So when I started podcasting, like I said, part of the reason why I wanted to podcast about immunology was because I didn't know much about the field in the African context. So because I have interest in immunology, periodically, of course, I read immunology articles, but some of the articles I usually read are not from Africa or about Africa. And during COVID, I wrote a lot about COVID for the newspaper I was writing for, and there may be a few other science blogs. And I knew Africans were getting things done in the context of the continent with immunology, but there really wasn't these platforms where I could learn about them or find articles. So part of the reason why I started the podcast was to really know what African scientists are doing in the field of immunology, right? So that was one reason why I started the podcast. So I think the most insightful thing for me is the realization that African scientists are getting things done in the field of immunology in the continent. Of course, I speak with Africans based in the continent and those outside the continent, but those in the continent, they're doing a whole lot, even with the limited resources, the challenges with funding, with getting reagents. There's just this passion and zeal, and resilience that they have with respect to the field. And they keep thinking of ways that, we could tailor solutions to our own context. I think that is a theme that keeps popping up in different episodes I have. One of the major highlights for me podcasting is the realization that African scientists, especially those within the continent, are getting a lot done in the field of immunology. So, of course, I speak with scientists based in the continent and those outside the continent, but focusing on those who are even within Africa and with the challenges, with the limitations posed by funding, and then maybe getting reagents and collaborations, they are still, able to work with these limited resources to do really, really groundbreaking research in the context of the continent. And a recurring theme for some of the episodes I've had is the whole idea of context, that the African context is different when we are discussing the immune system or discussing immunology, and that solutions, therapies, and vaccines have to be tailored to that context. That, there was an episode that I had about a scientist that was trying to understand why Africans and some low and middle income countries or settings do not respond so much or so well to vaccines, that, you give vaccines to people in Europe or maybe the Americas, their immune responses are quite better, more robust and higher than when we do the same here in Africa. So they're trying to understand some of these things. So there's this passion or zeal to understand immunology in the African context and think of how we can develop tailored solutions for, to help the African populace. And then, of course, there have also been insights regards the need to, strengthen intracontinental collaborations, collaborations among scientists within the continent. So individuals are not working with silos. So you are in Kenya, for instance, you are researching, you are exploring a topic that I'm also exploring here in Nigeria, but it's possible that we are not working together and we don't even know we are doing the same thing. So that's another thing that has also been common in the continent, that there has to be more collaborations among scientists within the continent, so we don't keep repeating kind of reinventing the wheel in the context of immunology research.
Don't go away. The conversation will continue momentarily after this special highlight.
Hi, my name is Dia Dwarkanath, and I'm the host of The Perspective, a new program on the Civic SciTV network. We add layers to the map of civic science that the network is building. In each segment, we bring in expert guests who are also civic science researchers or practitioners. We focus in on a particular issue, perhaps a recent finding related to it, and discuss how guests and/or their organizations are addressing it. From quantum outreach to equity in STEM, climate justice to quality psychology education, we dive into how scholars and practitioners are specifically engaging local communities in a two-way dialogue to solve these vast challenges. You'll take away actionable advice, key insights, what's next, and ideas on how to make science more civic. Watch the fun and inspiring perspectives of trailblazers on our program.
And for in the aspect of African research, highlighting African research, also with an African narrative in an African context, who would you say is your target audience, particularly for the podcast when you started and right now when you're looking at the statistics? Who do you find right now is your target, your listener?
Okay, so when I started out, I think I wanted a podcast that would, I really did not think of maybe a target audience. I wanted a podcast that would just cater to everybody, like maybe just science communication and, everybody should just be able to listen to my podcast. But I think with evolution or my growth over time, I realized it's important for me to have a defined audience. And I think right now, the people who I would say listen to the podcast more, I would say people who have interest in the field of immunology. So people who have interest in the field of immunology. So usually I would say students and scientists, but I also know there are individuals who are not really in this field of science or health who also listen to the podcast, like maybe non-specialists who also have interest in the podcast. But I think majority listeners are students and scientists based within or outside the continent. and then those who are generally interested in research about the immune system.
Mm-hmm. And if you look at our situation right now, the Mpox has been declared a global health emergency. What do you think is the potential of such spaces like the Science Podcast in engaging different audiences, be it in the science professional field or public? What do you think is the potential right now, having worked in this space for 2 years?
So I think podcasting generally has immense potential in science or community engagement. And I think one of the key edge podcasting has is the fact that it comes in audio format. So because there are individuals who may not have literacy skills, they may not be able to read about certain things if it's in writing, but when they hear it, they are able to understand it. They are able to, someone who is not educated listening to me now speak can make sense of what I'm saying. But if I were to put the same things I'm saying in writing, they may not be able to read it. So I think that's one potential that podcasting has over maybe other avenues of communicating science, like maybe newspapers and, magazines and all of that. And one thing I've thought about in the context of podcasting in the African context is I think it's an issue that has also been raised by a fellow podcaster in the continent, and that podcasting may not necessarily be suited to the African populace. That may sound contradictory because I also have majority listeners are from African countries for me, but of course, if I want to rank by country, the highest country listeners are not within the highest 2 countries I get as listeners are not within Africa. But if I were to rank by continent, majority are from Africa. But I think one underexplored opportunity is the radio and television. So I think it's like an unexplored opportunity for podcasts, because I like to think of the fact that podcasts could be, what's the word now? Podcasts could be presented on radio. So I like to think of the fact that podcasts can partner with radios or television stations and radio stations, television stations, such that instead of people just getting access, because typically my podcast, for instance, you need internet connection to listen to it. But there are individuals who are like in remote regions who don't have internet connection, do not have strong internet connection, that listen to radio, that listen to television. We could make versions of podcasts that can cater to these people. You're highlighting Mpox, for instance. For individuals who may not even never heard of Mpox, for instance, if they're like science podcasting platforms and that they may not be able to listen to via online, there could be versions of that podcast that could be shown on TV, or they could listen to on radio, that can educate them about the disease and help them, have the right response to disease.
And it's interesting how you're bringing in a podcast could be a bridge or a hybrid in between television and radio to look at the already existing platforms that we use. So as much as it can be inaccessible, partnership or collaboration, it could be also used in other platforms. And for you, what is the most challenging part in terms of having a podcast that focuses on a specific scientific discipline, in this case, immunology?
I like to think my challenge, or the challenge with podcasting for me, has evolved over time. Before I started, it was getting a guest. At a point, I was even contemplating whether I really wanted to start a podcast, because getting my first guest was difficult, really, really difficult. But I think once I delved into the terrain, getting guests became quite easier. Although it's not so easy yet, but yeah, it has become easier and faster. And then I think one last thing I would also mention is funding. The podcast is largely self-funded. And we know how all these things work, because it will affect quality, it will affect encroaching to your time for personal things. Although the podcast is very, very personal and very dear to my heart. And so I don't think of maybe time invested in it as maybe I should be doing something else. But I think having that funding gives you leverage, gives you more control, and allows you to do more. So, but those are like the challenges I can think of.
And for anyone who's starting or looking into starting a science podcast, what advice would you give them, or tip?
Well, I think they should start. That's the first advice I would give. I think they should start. And by starting, I don't mean you should just get a microphone and phone and maybe a device and start recording. But just have it at the back of your mind that you should start. Like I think we need more podcasters in the continent. And if someone is interested in podcasting, please, you're welcome to the family of African podcasters, especially African science podcasters. And I think maybe one or two advice would be that they should take time to plan. They should take time to prepare. And I think my podcast, I think something really interesting because I planned to launch at a certain time and then it didn't work out. But I feel like the delay helps me refine the goal, the focus, the quality of what I eventually launched with. So sometimes they might be delayed, but when you have a plan and you have a goal and then there's that desire or passion to start, you'll be able to, surmount all of those challenges, and then those delays will not amount to you deciding or changing your mind about starting a podcast. And then I think you should seek help early. And when people ask me, what challenges did you have before podcasting? I tell them I really don't have technical challenges because the science communicator, his name is Julius, who coached me, virtually told me everything I needed to know about podcasting, the tools I needed, the applications I needed to edit my audio or video. He told me, okay, this is where you should record, this is where you shouldn't record. So I really don't have maybe technical issues. Of course, quality might have improved over time, but like some of those major challenges, I didn't really struggle with any of that because I got guidance. So they should start, they should get guidance, and then they should just be prepared. They should plan, have a plan. And then I think it's important to also have a focus. I think it would be inappropriate to say you are just discussing science and you're targeting everybody. There should be like, what aspect of science are you focusing on? What angle are you focusing on if you're just discussing science generally? What's your target population? Because that will help you to, have shaping or sharpen your focus. So you're not just gambling in your episodes and then people come and then they listen, they don't know what they expect to get from the episode. So yeah, so those are the advice I would probably give, apart from the obvious technical advice of getting the tools and knowing how to use of them.
Thank you so much, Wealth. It's wonderful actually hearing your journey and how it's also evolved over time. And my last question as we close up, where do you hope to see ImmunoAfrica in 5 years? Or the work you're doing within the podcasting space?
Okay, so I think in 5 years' time, 5 years is quite a long time, but I'm hoping the podcast is able to collaborate more with other podcasts in Africa and outside of Africa, and also collaborate more with societies, immunological societies within and outside the continent. I like to think of the podcast as, representative of what is going on in immunology within Africa. And I think for the podcast to scale, we have to be working with and, aligning with the people that matter in the field of immunology, both within Africa and, globally. So I think that is one thing I look forward to. And then I also hope that ImmunoAfrica will be able to develop maybe small episodes or snippets that can be shared on radio or TV that the common man can benefit from. So they understand what Mpox is, they understand what COVID is, they understand what Lassa fever is. So they have this immunological understanding of diseases and how their body responds to them. And then I'm also hoping that we can have the podcast will be able to provide I'm not sure what to call it, but provide this long-term perspective of how African immunology has evolved over time. Mm-hmm. So we are able to have this document the evolution or progress of African immunology over time, not just from when the podcast started, but even from maybe the 90s, 80s, or whatever century immunology in Africa started developing from. But because other countries, they have this detailed knowledge about all of these things, but we don't have so much of documentation happening here in Africa. So I hope the podcast can be that platform that documents the progress, the journeys, and then the achievements of African immunology over the last couple of decades or maybe centuries.
Thank you so much. Well, then we're looking forward to more ImmunoAfrica episodes. And where could one find the episodes, on which platforms?
The podcast can be listened to on virtually all audio streaming platforms, but specifically we are on Spotify, we are on YouTube, we are on Apple Podcast, we are on Odyssey, and I think those are we are also on Amazon Music. So just search for the Immunology Africa Podcast, and yeah, you can listen to the episode that pops up.
Thank you so much, Wealth, and thank you for taking the time and looking forward to further engagement.